sculptor is Philip Ratner. The figure is another major piece in his series on the immigrant experience in America. More than 40 pieces make up the collection, each one commissioned privately and presented to the National Park Service as a gift to the nation. They commemorate the lives and times of America's immigrants. And their permanent home is here on Liberty Island, along with a symbol of America's golden door. America's immigrants. They came by the millions, a great human tide, drawn from Europe as if by some distant magnet. Some came to escape the famines, some to be free from persecution and the pogroms of a ruling class. Others came for a chance to own their own land, or to avoid conscription in the armies of a dying world. But most of all, they came to find work, where their future would no longer be frozen by the accident of birth. No simple formula can sum up their varied yearnings, or the new lives they were to find here. Their story, though, is ours, and in listening to it, we learn about ourselves. The 8 larger figures represent the way the members of a family came. This one is the working man. He usually came first, and he came alone. When he'd saved enough, he'd bring the others, sometimes one by one, sometimes year by year. We can only wonder what he was thinking as he started out. About all he was likely to say was, "My friend in America is doing well and has sent for me." The smaller pieces make up a grouping known as the Ellis Island Suite, and these tell the story of the journey itself, beginning at the time the immigrants left Europe. The details of the faces and the clothing of the figures have been left very soft. You can read into them whatever background or nationality you want. Their family is everyone's family. A boy and girl coming across alone. They could be from any town or village. So too a mother and her child, sitting on top of everything they own. For each of them, the first stop was Ellis Island. This was the gateway to America in the early 1900s, and inside it was the great Registry Hall. 5,000 people might pass through here in a day. And out of all the questions to be answered, all the tests to be passed, the one most frightening was the eye examination. It was for trachoma, an eye disease epidemic at the time. You might have it and not even know it, or your children might have it. If they found any sign of it, you could be quarantined or even sent back home. Most, though, made it through, and then went on downstairs to claim their baggage and their future. For many of them, the future began on New York's Lower East Side, in tenements so densely settled that a visitor once wrote, "The architecture itself seems to sweat humanity from every window and door." The streets, though, held a richness and variety of life you could find nowhere else in the world. And a family business could be started up without a stock room or a cash register. It was a time when communication was still a very personal thing, when your friend's balcony was the tenement's fire escape. And while the clothes dried, you talked of all the strange things you'd seen and heard on Delancey Street.
I'm a once-removed product from the East Side. My grandparents came to this country. My mother lived in New York, and I schooled there, and somehow feel very, very close to the whole experience of immigration and that piece of New York of that era because of my background and because I visit it often today and somehow feel I walked those streets. And I always felt that someday I wanted to put that experience into sculpture without really focusing on it until very recently. And the stories of my grandparents are still in the back of my head in that little library that every artist keeps of things you want to do someday. It also appeals to me because the East Side is the closest thing I can get to a real beginning in terms of a human experience other than my own beginnings with my work. My favorite part of being an artist is beginning something, is that first idea, the fresh hope that this is going to be the best thing you ever did, which had to be part of everybody coming here.
When Philip Ratner started on his project, only the East Side figures were in his mind. The project was to be the very personal expression of a single artist. But it soon attracted the attention of others, from the American Folk Life Center and the National Park Service. Their involvement provided historical accuracy to the project and broadened its scope. To the immigrant figures were added 5 life-size bronzes, which are outdoors, placed around the statue itself, to honor the people involved in its creation. Frederick Bartholdi, the French sculptor who created the figure of Liberty and selected its site. Gustave Eiffel, the famous engineer who devised the supporting framework. Joseph Pulitzer, publisher. He used his newspaper to raise the funds for the statue's base. Emma Lazarus, the poet whose well-known sonnet, "Give me your tired, your poor," is in the statue's pedestal. And Edouard René du Laboulaye, who conceived the monument to show the love of liberty shared by France and America. In creating all these pieces, Ratner used a mixture of materials and techniques. As a modeler, rather than a carver, he began each of the smaller figures with a welded steel armature. The armature is where he makes his commitment to the final gestures of the figures, the way they touch one another. This one is a father and his children looking over the railing of their ship. The larger figures were built up with successive layers of clay and plaster. Ratner's methods are his own, devised to keep the creative act as spontaneous as possible.
More has been written about the creative act, I imagine, than many other things. How artists think, and we all see Van Gogh out there suffering, ready to chop his ear off, and Michelangelo with paint dripping in his face, etc. Probably the most ludicrous are artists that write about their own work and who talk about the juxtaposition of form and of tensions and gesture, and critics who walk in front of 3 bricks piled on top of each other with a spike driven through that as the final statement of man imposing his will onto raw material. And none of that makes any difference, because every piece of work has to eventually stand on its own. And I don't know what people will read into my work, but whatever they read into it is valid. I don't aim to teach a lesson. I think art's about the poorest form to make great moral statements. I think that literature does it a heck of a lot better, and films, etc. So what an artist should do is to share with the world his feelings, his good, warm feelings of great love, of great anger, of great excitement, and put that down, put it in stone, put it in clay, put it in wood, and it's the greatest gift he can do.